It started with a ropier, maybe it started long before that, when a small-town gang thought they could scare a black family into running. They hung their threat right in front of his house, thinking he'd back down, thinking he'd pack up and leave quietly. But what they didn't know was that Victor Caldwell wasn't just any man. He was the wrong man to mess with. What comes next is bigger than one family. It's a fight for truth, for justice, and for a community that refuses to be silenced. And trust me, you won't believe what happens when the truth finally breaks wide open. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let us take you deep into this powerful story. Oh, and while you're here, drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Clearwater Heights wasn't on any map that mattered. Not really. Not unless you grew up believing small towns carried big promises. Victor Caldwell used to believe that. Used to think there was something sacred about quiet streets lined with mountain pines and cabins built from old timber, where neighbors waved just enough and porch lights stayed on well into the night. That belief had carried him and Charlene through 35 years of service, moving base to base, city to city, chasing duty like it was the only thing holding their life together. But now, here they were, standing on the worn wooden porch of a place they had chosen. Not because they had to, but because they finally could. Victor had spent months researching the town before they moved. The real estate listings promised fresh air, clean water, good schools. The promotional video on the town's official website even played soft acoustic music over shots of families walking their dogs, children riding bikes, and American flags fluttering under the Colorado sky. It seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But Victor had learned to trust data more than instincts. So when the background checks came back clean and the crime maps showed nothing more than the occasional speeding ticket, they packed up their life in Virginia and made the move west. Charlene had smiled the whole drive, her hand resting gently on his arm as they watched the mountains rise up on the horizon. Maya, their 15-year-old daughter, had fallen asleep in the back seat, with her sketchbook still open on her lap, pencil marks smudged across her fingers. Victor had glanced at them both in the rearview mirror more times than he could count, holding on to that fragile, unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe this time, they'd found somewhere to breathe. The house sat on the edge of town, right where the forest line started to swallow the paved streets. A 2-story log cabin with a wraparound porch and enough space for Charlene to start the garden she'd been talking about for years. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. And that first night, when they unpacked the last box and stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by empty cartons and the soft hum of the refrigerator, Victor had let himself believe they'd finally outrun the noise of the world. But the thing about silence is, it's never empty. Sometimes it hums in ways you don't notice at first, subtle, slow, like a low vibration under your feet. Victor first felt it when he waved at the man 2 houses down and got nothing back but a nod so tight it might as well have been a dismissal. He felt it again when the woman walking her dog crossed the street to avoid passing their driveway. And then there were the looks, not long, not blatant, just quick glances that lasted half a second too long before the faces turned away, like shadows trying not to leave a trace. He didn't tell Charlene right away. She had already fallen in love with the way the sunlight hit the kitchen window each morning, and how Maya had started to sleep through the night for the first time in months. Victor didn't want to disturb that peace not yet, so he let it sit in his chest like a stone, pressing just hard enough to remind him that something wasn't settling right beneath the surface of this perfect little town. One morning, about 3 weeks after they moved in, Victor stood at the edge of the driveway with his coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. A delivery truck rattled down the street. A teenager on a bike swerved past without looking up. And across the road, an old man in a ball cap stood on his porch folding an American flag with slow, practiced care. Victor watched the man's hands work the fabric into neat triangles, each movement deliberate, mechanical, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. When the man finished, he turned slightly, just enough to meet Victor's gaze for the briefest moment. There was no smile, no wave, just eyes that held something unreadable, something old and heavy, like history that had never really gone anywhere. Victor nodded, slow and measured, then turned back toward the house, closing the screen door behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. He set his coffee down on the counter, leaned both hands on the cool granite, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Somewhere deep in his gut, where years of training had taught him to listen more than speak, Victor Caldwell knew this place wasn't going to let them settle in quietly. And in that moment, standing alone in the stillness of his kitchen, he understood something even deeper. The silence here wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. The morning the rope showed up was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence itself. Victor had woken early, earlier than normal, not because he couldn't sleep, but because something about the air that day felt different, heavier, sharper, like the earth itself had shifted ever so slightly in the night. He stood by the window longer than usual, staring out across the street where the mist hung low over the tree line, watching as the first light broke against the worn asphalt. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, the kind of smell that used to make him feel alive. But today it just felt still. He sipped his coffee slower than usual, every movement deliberate, almost like he was trying to give himself an extra moment to adjust to whatever the day had planned for him. Charlene had left a note on the fridge, her handwriting small but neat, reminding him that she'd taken Maya to school early for her art project display. He traced the edge of the paper with his finger for just a second, then set his mug down without finishing the last sip. Reaching for the old gray sweatshirt hanging on the back of the chair, he slid his arms through the sleeves, pulling it tight around his chest as he made his way toward the front door. The floor creaked beneath his feet, like it always did. But today the sound felt louder, more deliberate, like the house itself was holding its breath right along with him. When he opened the door, the morning hit him all at once, crisp air filling his lungs, the faint hum of a lawnmower starting somewhere down the street, the steady clicking of a sprinkler spinning to life a few houses over. For a second, it felt normal, like any other Tuesday. He stepped down onto the porch, barefoot, feeling the cool wood under his feet, and walked toward the edge of the steps where the morning paper usually waited. But the paper wasn't the first thing he noticed. There, hanging from the old iron hook where they used to hang wind chimes in the summer, was a thick, weathered rope, twisted into a perfect noose. The knot sat heavy, tight, and deliberate, the loop swaying slightly in the morning breeze, as if it had been waiting for him to find it. Victor didn't move at first. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He just stood there, staring at it, feeling something deep in his chest tighten like a fist curling around his ribs. It wasn't just a rope. It was a message, one he'd seen before, in other towns, in other lives, but never here, never this close. Not on his porch, not where his daughter played, not where his wife planted her sunflowers last week, hopeful that they'd take root in this new soil. He glanced quickly toward the street, scanning for movement, but the block was empty. No footsteps, no engines. Just stillness so sharp it felt like the trees themselves were listening. He felt the weight of the air pressing in around him, thick with the knowledge that someone had stood in this exact spot hours earlier, close enough to touch the door, close enough to leave something that wasn't just meant to scare but to mark. Victor swallowed hard, pressing his tongue to the roof of his mouth like he used to do when the pressure in his chest got too tight. His fists clenched at his sides, not out of fear, but out of something colder, something heavier. Slowly, he reached up, his fingers brushing the rough fiber of the knot, feeling the coarse strands against his skin. He didn't take it down. He didn't rip it apart. He just let his hand fall back to his side, turned on his heel, and walked back inside without a word. He locked the door behind him softly, turning the deadbolt with the same steady hand he used when assembling a rifle in the dark. His breath stayed slow, his face unreadable. But inside, something had already started to move, something he hadn't felt in years. He crossed the room without turning on the lights, stepping into the study where his old equipment still sat tucked away in the corner cabinet. He reached for the drawer, sliding it open with care, pulling out the worn black notebook where he kept notes no one else had ever seen. Opening to a blank page, he wrote down one word in the center, slow and deliberate: Noose. Underneath, he wrote the date, the time, and one sentence that only he would understand. They crossed the line today. Then he closed the book, slid it back into the drawer, and leaned back in the chair, his hands resting flat on the desk, palms open, steady, ready. He didn't need to say a word to know that everything had just changed. The rope was still hanging on the porch, and outside, the town kept breathing like nothing had happened. But Victor Caldwell knew better. The war hadn't started that morning. It had only just shown its face. Victor didn't tell Charlene about the noose that night, not because he was hiding it from her, but because he needed time to process what it really meant. He needed to sit with it, to let it settle somewhere deeper than just anger or fear, because both of those emotions had a way of burning out too quickly. What he needed was clarity, the kind that didn't come with slamming fists or shouting threats, but with quiet observation, the kind he had spent his entire career mastering. So, he let the evening unfold like nothing had happened, sitting at the dinner table while Maya talked about her art project, and Charlene asked about the new grocery store she wanted to check out on Saturday. He nodded when he was supposed to, smiled when it felt natural, and kept his breathing steady even when his mind was running miles ahead of the moment. Later, after Maya had gone to bed, and Charlene was curled up on the couch reading under the soft yellow glow of the lamp, Victor slipped into the study again, closing the door with the kind of care that made no sound at all. He sat down at his desk, powered up the old laptop that had never once touched the internet, and opened the secure folder labeled Personal Research. It was a habit he had started long ago, back when he still worked for the Department of Defense, monitoring civilian data streams for signs of unrest that no one wanted to admit were real. He had built systems for identifying threats before they surfaced patterns of behavior, hidden connections, unspoken signals. And now, sitting in the quiet hum of his own home, he knew without question that he had seen this pattern before. He pulled up the archived neighborhood watch forums, the ones that never showed up on public search engines but were always there if you knew how to find them. Clearwater Heights had its own thread, tucked beneath layers of usernames and digital fences, a place where people talked about keeping the community safe, in language that was polite on the surface but carried a weight Victor recognized all too well. He scrolled past the posts about potholes and stray dogs, digging deeper until he started seeing phrases like preserving neighborhood integrity and removing outside influences. It wasn't direct, never was, but it was enough. Enough to make his skin tighten across his shoulders as he leaned closer to the screen. He switched tabs and pulled up the surveillance feed from the cameras he had installed when they first moved in. One hidden in the porch light, another angled low from the base of the mailbox, and a third watching the alley behind the house where the tree line swallowed the back fence. He rewound the footage from earlier that morning, frame by frame, breath holding steady as the screen flickered through hours of stillness. Then he saw it, a figure, hooded and quick, stepping into the frame at 2:17 a.m. The footage wasn't perfect, the angle was wide, the lighting poor, but Victor could see enough. The way the man moved with purpose, not like a stranger who had stumbled into the wrong yard, but like someone who knew exactly where the camera's blind spots were. He never looked up, never hesitated. He pulled the rope from under his jacket, tied it with practiced speed, and disappeared into the dark before the motion sensor even had time to blink. Victor sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, feeling something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't kids pulling a prank. This was coordinated, intentional, and far too familiar. His hands moved without thinking, pulling out an old notebook where he used to log threat markers during his service years. He drew the same looped noose in the center of the page, then traced a small crow beneath an old symbol he hadn't seen in years, one tied to fringe groups that had once called themselves the Silver Vultures. He had read about them once, back when they operated in rural towns a few states over, branding themselves as defenders of American values, but always targeting the same families, the same faces. They never lasted long in one place, always shifting, always hiding behind new names, new slogans, but the symbol had stayed the same. A silver vulture, wings spread, claws down, marked on mailboxes, fences, and garages. Victor hadn't thought about them in over a decade. He had hoped they were gone, scattered like so many other small-town vigilante groups that burned out when no one paid them any mind. But here they were again, or at least someone wearing their skin. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the breath leave his body slowly, pressing his palms flat against the desk, as if steadying himself against a wave he couldn't quite see yet. He didn't need confirmation. He didn't need to hear anyone admit it. He knew. The silver vultures were here, alive and watching, and they had already marked his family. With steady hands, he closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and sat there in the dark for a long while. He didn't flinch when the old wooden floor creaked beneath the house, settling into its bones. He didn't move when the wind pressed softly against the window panes. He just stayed there, eyes open, heart steady, knowing full well that whatever was coming next wouldn't wait for permission. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of discipline and control, Victor Caldwell smiled just once, faint and bitter, because they had made their first move, but they had no idea who they had just woken up. It started with a sound Victor couldn't quite place, the kind that doesn't belong on a street like theirs. He had been sitting by the window again, lights off, coffee cold, waiting for something he couldn't name, but felt closing in all the same. The hum of a single engine drifted through the trees sometime after midnight, low and steady, like whoever was driving wasn't in a hurry to be seen, just steady enough to let their presence linger on the edge of awareness. He didn't move at first, didn't rush to the window or grab the binoculars like instinct told him to. He simply sat there, listening to the slow roll of tires on gravel, listening the way a man listens when he already knows the answer, but needs to hear it said aloud. And then it stopped abruptly, without the soft hiss of brakes or the crack of a door hinge. Just silence again, heavier than before, thick as concrete settling on his chest. Victor stood slowly, every movement measured, and stepped toward the back of the house, where the darkness outside pressed against the glass like a warning. His eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the yard, the fence line, the alley beyond. Nothing moved. No headlights, no footsteps. Only the low hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence behind him like a ticking clock in a room full of ghosts. He waited another minute, maybe two, then turned to check the porch camera feed. But the screen flickered, not dead, not disconnected, but distorted like interference crawling through the signal in soft, jagged waves. He leaned closer, adjusting the feed, his jaw tightening as the picture sharpened just enough to reveal what they had done. It wasn't the Noose this time. The garage door had been spray-painted in thick, red, letter-screwed, messy, but large enough that even from the far end of the block, no one could claim they hadn't seen it. The words bled down the panel like a fresh wound. "Get out or burn." Victor didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't even blink. He pressed pause on the footage, breathing through his nose until the pressure in his chest settled into something colder, something heavier than fear. When he stepped outside, the air smelled different: oil, rubber, something sharp like metal and sweat. His breath hung in the cold, small clouds disappearing too quickly to make a difference. He didn't bother with shoes. His feet touched the damp concrete of the driveway, bare and steady, as he made his way toward the car. He already knew what he was going to find, but seeing it hit differently. Both vehicles' tires slashed clean through, deep cuts running straight across the sidewalls like surgical wounds left to rot in the open. For a long moment, Victor stood in the middle of the driveway, his hands hanging loose at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling like they had a mind of their own. He didn't touch the tires. He didn't reach for the garage door. He just turned his head slightly, eyes lifting toward the darkened windows across the street, knowing full well someone was watching. Knowing full well someone wanted him to react, to explode, to give them exactly what they'd come for. But Victor Caldwell had learned long ago that the loudest man in the room was usually the one who lost first. He turned back toward the house, walked inside, and closed the door with the same quiet control that had carried him through years of conflict most men wouldn't dare remember. Charlene was already standing at the foot of the stairs, her arms crossed, her face pale but steady. "What did they do?" she asked softly, not because she didn't already know, but because saying it aloud was the only way to make it real. Victor rubbed the back of his neck, eyes locking with hers in a way that said everything words couldn't carry. "The garage," he answered quietly. "And the cars." Charlene nodded once, her throat moving like she was swallowing something she couldn't quite name. She didn't cry, she didn't fall apart. Instead, she walked past him toward the front door, stopping just long enough to press her hand against the glass, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. "We should call someone," she whispered, but the way she said it told him she already knew it wouldn't change a thing. "We could," Victor replied softly, "but you already know how that ends." She turned to face him then, her voice barely holding itself together. "So, what? We just leave it there for the whole neighborhood to see?" Victor took a slow breath, stepped closer, and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes," he said, steady as stone. "That's exactly what we do." Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to scream that he was wrong, that this wasn't how normal people lived. But in the end, she just stood there, staring at him with eyes that held more worry than anger, more love than fear. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it. "Just promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you won't let this pull you into something we can't come back from." Victor didn't answer right away. He couldn't, not without lying. So instead, he reached up, cupped her face gently in both hands, and pressed his forehead to hers, in the kind of silence that spoke louder than any vow he could have made. Outside, the words on the garage glared back at the empty street like blood on snow, loud enough for the whole town to read. And Victor knew, without question, that this was far from over. Victor had always believed in preparation, not as a reaction to fear, but as a way of reclaiming control when the world started to shift beneath your feet. That belief had carried him through battlefields half a world away, through briefings so classified they didn't leave a paper trail, through sleepless nights spent reading signals and piecing together patterns no one else could see. But nothing, not the years of military protocol, not the hours spent in dimly lit rooms watching enemy movements on cold monitor shad, prepared him for the sound of his daughter's voice, breaking the tension in the kitchen the next morning, asking softly, "Daddy, why did someone write on our house?" He stood there, holding his breath, watching Charlene freeze mid-motion as she reached for the coffee pot. For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to fill the entire room. Victor turned slowly, meeting Maya's eyes across the small kitchen table where she sat with her sketchbook half open in front of her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't scared in the way little kids get scared. She just looked disappointed, like she already understood more than a 15-year-old should have to understand. Victor crossed the room in a few steady steps and knelt down in front of her, lowering his voice so it wouldn't crack under the weight of what he had to say. "Someone's trying to scare us," he whispered gently. "But I need you to remember something. Baby-scared people leave, and we're not leaving." Maya nodded slowly, pressing her lips into a thin line, and reached out to take his hand without saying another word. Charlene turned away toward the sink, and though she tried to move quietly, Victor heard the small, sharp breath she let out when she thought neither of them could hear. That morning, after dropping Maya off at school, Victor sat in the driveway for a long time with the engine running, staring at the red letters still smeared across the garage door like an open wound refusing to scab over. He could have painted over it. He could have scrubbed it clean before the neighbors finished their morning coffee. But something in him knew better. This wasn't just a mess to erase. It was a messages, and like all messages, it deserved to be read. By noon, he had pulled every piece of surveillance equipment he owned from storage. Cameras, motion sensors, backup drives, lenses he hadn't used since the last contract he walked away from. He didn't bother hiding them this time. He mounted them openly along the porch, tucked others into the hedges, and slipped one inside the mailbox just beneath the latch where fingers would never think to check. He calibrated each one with the precision of a man building something not to protect himself, but to capture every lie they tried to tell. He didn't stop there. He built a second network offline, isolated, fed through a dedicated server, locked inside a fireproof case bolted beneath his desk. No Wi-Fi, no cloud, no way for anyone outside that house to touch it. Every camera fed into that system in real time, time-stamped, tagged, backed up twice. He programmed heat sensors along the alley fence and mounted a fisheye lens high in the oak tree out front, disguised as part of a birdhouse Charlene had planned to fill with seed. By the time the sun began to sink behind the trees, Victor stood in the center of his yard, sweat on his brow, dirt under his nails, and not a single doubt in his mind that whoever had done this would be back. The question wasn't if, it was when. Charlene stepped out onto the porch just as he finished securing the last mount under the gutter, her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the dimming light. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't have to. Instead, she leaned against the railing and let the silence fill the space between them like it always had when they ran out of words. "You really think this will stop them?" she finally asked, her voice softer than usual but steady. Victor stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans before walking toward her. "No," he answered, honest and quiet. "But it'll show them I'm watching too." She nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of the man she'd married, the man who never raised his voice when a quiet stare could cut deeper, the man who had spent years dismantling threats that didn't have faces, only patterns. And now, for the first time in a long time, those patterns had come home. That night, after Maya had gone to bed and Charlene had retreated to the back porch with her book, Victor sat in the study alone, the soft glow of the monitor painting shadows across his face. He opened a new file and labeled it Clearwater Watch 01 _. Slowly, he began adding the first entries, timestamps, license plate numbers, descriptions of movements, and screenshots of every neighbor who had passed by that day without once looking toward the garage door. He paused on one image, a dark pickup truck with a dented fender parked just beyond the alley 2 nights earlier. The camera had caught it in perfect clarity. No plates, no driver visible, but the sticker on the back window was unmistakable. A vulture with outstretched wings, silver and faded, just like the ones he'd seen in the classified reports all those years ago. Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly through his nose, and let the weight of the realization settle deep in his chest. The silver vultures hadn't just returned, they had never left. They had been waiting, nesting quietly in the spaces where good people refused to look too closely. And now they had marked his family, thinking they'd picked an easy target. Victor Caldwell knew better. He reached for the small, leather-bound notebook on the corner of his desk, flipped it open to a fresh page, and wrote 4 words that felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. "I see you now." Then he closed the book, shut down the lights, and let the house settle back into silence this time, on his term. By the time the weekend came, Victor had already sent out 3 separate packages. Each one was carefully compiled, sealed in plain brown envelopes with no return address, containing printed photos, timestamps, vehicle descriptions, and a written summary of what had happened on his property. One was mailed to the sheriff's office tip line, another to a small civil rights advocacy group he had followed quietly for years, and the third, perhaps the one he believed had the smallest chance of being seen, was dropped off at the town's only independent newspaper. He didn't expect much from any of them, but it wasn't about expecting, it was about documenting, about forcing the story into places where someone, somewhere, might have no choice but to acknowledge it. And then, just like that, nothing happened. Days passed. Long, slow, heavy days that dragged with the weight of expectation sitting on his shoulders like wet concrete. No knock on the door, no phone call, not even a single email. The sheriff didn't show up. The newspaper ran no story. The neighbors kept walking their dogs and waving at each other like there wasn't a 6-foot warning painted on his garage for everyone to see. On Monday morning, Victor stood at the end of the driveway with the garden hose in his hand, staring at the dried spray paint flaking under the midday sun. He hadn't touched it since the night they wrote it. Part of him had hoped that leaving it there would force someone to confront it. Maybe a neighbor would ask if he needed help or if he was okay. Maybe the HOA would send one of their passive-aggressive letters about property standards. But no one did. The town moved around it like it wasn't even there. Charlene came outside and stood on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, watching him. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her face tight with something between worry and frustration. When she finally spoke, her voice carried more weight than he expected. "You really gonna leave it up forever?" she asked quietly. Victor didn't turn to face her. He kept his eyes on the garage door, watching how the paint had started to crack and peel along the edges. He let the hose hang loose in his hand, water pooling at his feet before spilling into the street. "I need people to see it," he answered softly, more to himself than to her. Charlene let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in her chest for days. She walked down the steps and stood beside him, her voice lower now, sharper. "They already see it," she whispered. "They've seen it every day since it showed up, and none of them have said a damn thing." Victor finally turned toward her, looking down at the woman who had stood beside him through more deployments than he could count, through moves, through losses, through every quiet battle that had shaped their lives into something both fragile and unbreakable. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the fatigue, the ache of waiting for something to give. "Then at least they'll never be able to say they didn't know," he said, his voice steady but heavy. Charlene didn't argue. She just shook her head slowly, biting the inside of her cheek like she was holding back words that would cost more than they were worth. That night, Victor checked the cameras again. Same streets, same shadows, same silence. He scrubbed through hours of footage, frame by frame, looking for movement, looking for faces. And every time the frames came up empty, something in him twisted tighter. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his hands over his face, and stared at the wall where he had pinned the printed photos, the ones showing the truck with no plates, the man in the hoodie, the noose. He knew the silence wasn't just absence, it was strategy. It was a wall built out of polite smiles and closed doors, a quiet agreement between neighbors to pretend nothing had happened so they wouldn't have to pick a side. And in that silence, Victor felt something else creeping in, something colder, heavier, doubt. Not in himself, but in the system, in the place they had chosen to build a life. The next morning, Charlene didn't join him at the kitchen table. She moved quietly through the house, gathering her things, brushing Maya's hair without a word, avoiding his eyes the way people avoid broken glass on the floor. Victor watched her from across the room, the weight in his chest pressing harder with every silent step she took. When she finally picked up her purse and paused at the door, she turned just enough to meet his gaze. "You can't fight a wall, Vic," she whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. "All you can do is wait for it to fall on its own, or find a way to climb over it." And then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Victor standing in the middle of the house that suddenly felt a whole lot emptier than it had the night before. He walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little, watching as Charlene and Maya disappeared down the street in the car. The garage still stood there, marked and peeling, the words fading but never really leaving. Victor pressed his hand against the glass, leaning into the silence, feeling the weight of it settle deep in his bone. And for the first time since this started, he let his hand fall to the windowsill, curling into a fist knot in anger, but in something closer to resignation, because now he knew. The quiet wasn't just the town refusing to speak, it was the sound of every door already closed. Victor knew they were testing him now, not just with what they left behind on his property, but with how far they could push without crossing a line anyone in power was willing to admit existed. He could feel it in the way the neighborhood seemed to move around them now, not just with avoidance, but with something colder, calculated indifference. He started noticing the shift in little things first, small details that would have seemed innocent to anyone else. The delivery driver who used to wave now dropped their packages on the edge of the driveway, never coming close to the porch. The neighbor across the street who used to make polite conversation about weather or lawn care now turned his back just a little too quickly every time their paths crossed. Even the mail came later than usual, like the carrier had rearranged their route just to make their house the last stop of the day. But it was Maya who felt it first in a way Victor hadn't prepared for, and when it hit without warning. She came home from school on Thursday, quieter than usual, her backpack heavier somehow. Like the weight inside it wasn't just books or papers, but something sharper. Charlene had noticed it too. She watched their daughter cross the living room, drop her bag by the door, and head straight for her room without even taking off her shoes. Victor waited a minute before following, standing in the hallway just outside her door, listening to the sound of pencil on paper. It was steady, rhythmic, but tense, like she was pressing too hard, like the lead would snap at any second. He knocked softly, waited for her to say something, but she didn't. When he finally pushed the door open, Maya didn't look up. She just kept drawing, her shoulders tight, her face set in a way that broke something small inside his chest. He walked in slowly, sitting on the edge of her bed, watching the way her hand moved over the page without stopping. "What are you working on?" he asked gently, though the answer didn't really matter. She paused for half a second, just long enough to let out a small breath through her nose, then turned the sketchbook toward him. What he saw made his stomach turn. 4 stick figures standing in a row, their heads circled in red, their faces blank. Across the top of the page, in shaky block letters, she had written, "They wait." Victor swallowed hard, reaching out to take the notebook from her lap. "Who's waiting, baby?" he whispered, his voice catching before he could stop it. Maya finally looked up at him, her eyes glassy but dry. "The girls at school," she said softly. "They told me I don't belong here. They said I should leave before someone makes me." Victor closed his eyes, pressing his hand to his mouth like it might keep the words from slipping through the cracks in his resolve. He had prepared for so many things, so many angles of this fight, but hearing it come out of his daughter's mouth made it feel different. It made it real, in a way nothing else had yet. Charlene found him sitting on the porch later that night, the sketchbook still in his hands, the pages soft from where he had traced the edges over and over again. She didn't sit down right away. She stood behind him, arms crossed, the weight of the house pressing down on both of them like a storm they couldn't outrun. "We can't keep doing this, Vic," she whispered finally, her voice shaking just enough to make him close the book and set it down beside him. "She's just a kid." Victor nodded slowly, staring out into the darkness where the streetlight flickered at the end of the block. "I know," he said, and the truth of it tasted bitter in his mouth. "I know." Charlene stepped closer, placing her hand on his shoulder, her touch soft but urgent. "We need to go, just for a while. Let this blow over." Victor turned to face her, the look in his eyes heavier than any argument he could make. "And if it doesn't?" he asked, his voice low. "If this is just the beginning?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because they both knew the truth. Leaving wouldn't fix it. Running wouldn't erase it. It would only move the fight to someone else's doorstep, someone who might not be ready, someone without the tools, someone without the history. Victor stood slowly, wrapping his arms around Charlene's waist, pulling her close enough that he could feel her heart beating against his chest. "I can't run from this," he whispered into her hair. "Not again." She held him tighter, her breath catching in her throat. "Just don't make us watch you fall apart trying to fight it alone." Victor nodded against her shoulder, pressing his lips to her temple in a silent promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. The porch light buzzed softly above them, flickering like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. And in that moment, standing in the quiet hum of the night with his family stretched thinner than he'd ever seen, Victor knew something had already shifted. He wasn't just standing his ground anymore. He was preparing for war. Victor didn't remember falling asleep that night, but he remembered the sound that pulled him from it like a sharp breath dragged through the ribs. It wasn't the normal creaks and groans of the old house settling. It wasn't the soft hum of the fridge or the rustling branches brushing against the side of the house. It was sharper, closer, the kind of sound that came from something breaking, something giving way under pressure. He sat up before his mind fully caught up with his body, feet already hitting the floor, his breath still caught somewhere between sleep and full awareness. Charlene stirred beside him, her hand reaching instinctively toward his arm, her voice barely a whisper in the dark. "Vic, what was that?" Victor didn't answer right away. He already knew better than to give false comfort. He just leaned over, kissed her forehead quickly, and whispered back, "Stay with Maya." By the time he reached the living room, the second sound came louder this time, closer, carrying weight like fire cracking wood apart. His heart dropped low in his chest, sinking deeper with every step as he made his way to the front window. The glow hit his eyes before his mind could form the words for what he was seeing. There, 3 houses down, just past the curve of the street where the road dipped behind a row of sagging mailboxes, flames danced high above the roof of the Parker family's garage. Orange light flickered against the dark sky like a heartbeat pulsing out of control. The Parkers were new to the neighborhood too, a black family who had arrived only weeks after the Caldwells, with smiles too wide and hopes too high for a place like this. Victor didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, shoved his feet into his boots, and threw open the front door without thinking twice. Charlene's voice called after him, tight with fear but not loud enough to stop him. The street felt colder than it should have as he ran toward the fire, his breath sharp in his throat, his boots hitting the pavement in quick, heavy strides. The heat hit him before he reached the yard, the kind of heat that feels alive, like it's breathing right along with you. The garage door had already begun to curl inward, blackened by flame, the windows blown out, glass scattered across the driveway, like sharp stars caught in the flicker of the fire's glow. He caught sight of Mr. Parker dragging a garden hose toward the flames, coughing hard, his movements frantic but useless against the growing fire. Mrs. Parker stood on the porch clutching their son, who looked no older than 8, her free hand trembling as she held her phone to her ear, probably shouting into a dispatcher's silence. Victor's stomach turned when he realized no sirens were coming, not yet, not fast enough. He dropped low, moving toward the side yard, using the bushes as cover as he scanned the street for anyone who didn't belong. That's when he saw it. A dark figure slipping through the trees behind the Parkers' house. Too fast to be a neighbor, too practiced to be a stranger. Victor pulled his phone from his pocket, snapped a quick photo, and followed the figure's path with his eyes until it disappeared into the alleyway, like smoke fading into the night. He turned back toward the house just as the roof gave in with a groaning crack, the flames spilling higher, licking at the edges of the house itself. The sound of the wood snapping echoed through the street like thunder. Victor's fists clenched at his sides as helplessness pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. His jaw tightened when he saw the symbol, one he knew too well, spray painted in black across the garage wall. A silver vulture, wings spread wide, claws down. The mark wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. It was a signature, deliberate, meant to be seen. Finally, the sirens came too late, but loud enough to make the air feel tighter, the pressure in Victor's chest heavier. He stepped back, moving through the shadows toward the sidewalk, his heart pounding hard against his ribs. He watched as the firefighters moved in, dragging hoses, shouting commands, trying to save what little remained. But Victor knew better. This wasn't just fire damage. This was a message. He pulled his phone from his pocket again, snapping more photos off the flames, of the symbol, of the empty street where no one dared to step outside and witness the truth. He didn't speak. He didn't move until the Parkers were ushered into a neighbor's house by one of the firefighters. Only then did Victor turn, walking slowly back toward his own house, his fists still tight, his breath still sharp, his mind racing faster than his feet could carry him. When he stepped back onto his porch, Charlene was waiting just inside the door, her eyes wide with something deeper than fear, something closer to heartbreak. He didn't speak at first. He just held up his phone, showing her the photo of the symbol burned into their neighbor's home. "They did it again," he whispered. Charlene swallowed hard, leaning against the doorframe like her knees might give way. "Are they okay?" she asked. But she already knew the answer. "They're alive," Victor replied softly, his voice breaking on the last word. "But this was a warning for us too." She didn't speak again. She just reached for his hand, pulling him inside, locking the door behind them like it might actually hold back what was coming next. Victor stood there in the dim light of the hallway, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders like a second skin. He knew they wouldn't stop, and this time, they had made it personal. Victor didn't sleep after the fire. He didn't even try. His body went through the motions brewing coffee, rinsing dishes, pacing the floor, but his mind never stopped moving. It circled the same questions again and again like a storm without a break in the clouds. Who was pulling the strings? Who was keeping the police silent? How deep did this thing go? The Parker family had nearly lost their home, and Victor knew deep down in his bones that it could have just as easily been his family instead. By noon, Victor sat back in the study, staring at the screen, the footage from the night before playing in slow looping silence. He watched the glow of the fire again and again, watched the dark figure vanish through the alley again and again, until his jaw ached from clenching his teeth. He paused the frame on the license plate of a dark pickup that had left the scene just minutes before the first flames caught. The image was blurry, but there was enough to work with. He enhanced the photo the best he could, zoomed in on a faint sticker on the rear window, and there it was again, the unmistakable outline of the silver vulture's emblem. His chest tightened as he leaned back, staring at the screen like it might give him something more, but he already knew what he had to do. Reaching for his phone, Victor scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a name he hadn't spoken to in years, Marcus Wynn. They used to work side by side, years ago, back when Victor was still neck-deep in government contracts and cybersecurity briefings. Marcus was the one guy he knew could dig deeper than anyone else, the only person who could break through layers Victor no longer had access to. He tapped the call button without giving himself time to second-guess it. After 2 rings, A deep voice answered, low and cautious. "Vic, that really you?" Victor swallowed hard before speaking, his voice quieter than he expected. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make Victor wonder if Marcus might hang up. But then the voice came back, steady and serious. "Tell me everything." Victor explained the noose, the threats, the vandalism, the Parker family's fire. He described the silver vultures, the way they'd marked his house, the trucks with no plates, the silence from the sheriff's office. And when he finished, Marcus let out a long breath like he'd already been expecting something like this. Like he'd seen the signs before Victor ever picked up the phone. "You're not the first to call me about something like this," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with something that sounded a lot like regret. "But you might be the first one they're actually scared of." Victor leaned forward in his chair, gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles ached. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed again, softer this time. "You remember Operation Anchor?" Victor felt his breath catch, his stomach twisting at the mention of a name he hadn't heard in almost a decade. "That program was shut down years ago," Victor whispered. "Not exactly," Marcus replied, his voice dropping even lower. "It was buried, rebranded, stripped of oversight, but it never really died. And the tech they're using in your town? It smells like old anchor code to me." Victor closed his eyes, pressing his hand to his forehead like the pressure might stop the room from spinning. "Jesus, Marcus, you're saying they're using federal tech? Civilian side?" Marcus didn't answer right away. When he did, it came out like a warning wrapped in something colder. "I've been watching similar patterns pop up in small towns all over. Vigilante groups getting their hands on old surveillance protocol sheet mapping, neighborhood profiling, real-time tracking systems. It's the same framework we used to build. And Vic, it's showing up in places that shouldn't have the clearance to even know it exists." Victor pushed back from the desk, standing too fast, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. His mind raced through memories of classified meetings, of systems they were told would never leave secure networks. He paced the room, running his hand through his hair, gripping the back of his neck as if the tension might snap something loose. "You still have access to the old back doors?" Victor asked finally, his voice low but urgent. "I do," Marcus answered without hesitation. "And if I'm right, I can trace the architecture they're using back to its source." Victor nodded slowly, the weight in his chest shifting into something sharper, something alive. "Do it," he whispered. "And if you find anything, you send it straight to me." The call ended as quietly as it had started, but Victor stood there for a long time afterward, staring at the darkened screen like it held every answer he was afraid to hear. Charlene's voice broke the silence behind him, soft but steady. "What did he say?" Victor turned to face her, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he tried to find the right words. He crossed the room in 2 slow steps, stopping just in front of her, lowering his voice to something almost fragile. "They're using government tech," he whispered, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. "They're running surveillance like it's a war zone." Charlene's face paled, her breath catching as she shook her head. "But that's illegal. That's—" Victor cut her off, pressing his hands to her shoulders, holding her steady like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "That's what we thought. But it's happening, and they're doing it right under everyone's nose." Charlene's eyes filled with something that looked like fear, but deeper, heavier. "What do we do?" Victor didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the window, staring out into the street that had already taken so much from them, his voice dropping into something more certain, more dangerous. "We show the world!" And just like that, the weight on his chest shifted into resolve, solid and unmovable, because now they weren't just protecting their family, they were exposing something far bigger than Clearwater Heights had ever dared to face. Victor drove with both hands locked tight on the steering wheel, the silence in the car stretching longer than any stretch of highway he'd ever known. The road out toward Ashwood Chapel was quiet this time of day. A narrow 2-lane stretch running between old pine trees and forgotten farmland, the kind of place you passed without slowing down, unless you already knew what you were looking for. The morning light slanted through the windshield in pale gold strips, cutting across the dust rising from the tires. The farther he drove, the heavier the weight in his chest settled, a pressure that didn't come from fear but from knowing the answers he was chasing might cost more than he was ready to admit. He hadn't spoken to Darnell Price in almost a year, not since the man's health had started slipping, not since the old community leader had quietly stepped back from the spotlight and left others to carry the load. But Victor remembered what Darnell had once told him, sitting in the back of that same church, with nothing but old folding chairs and stale coffee between them. The moment you think the fight's over is when they build it all again in silence. Victor hadn't understood the weight of that sentence back then, not fully. But he understood it now. When he pulled into the gravel lot beside the chapel, the place looked smaller than he remembered. The paint had faded along the windowsills, the ramp railings rusted at the corners, but the bell tower still stood straight and steady against the sky. He killed the engine and sat for a long moment, watching as the wind tugged at the edge of an old vinyl banner that read, "Community meeting tonight, all are welcome." He knew better than to believe those words meant what they used to, but something about seeing them again made his throat tighten all the same. Darnell was already waiting on the porch when Victor stepped out of the car, his frame thinner than Victor remembered, but his posture still carrying that same unspoken authority that had filled crowded rooms without ever needing to raise his voice. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched Victor approach, eyes narrowing slightly, like he'd already guessed why this visit wasn't just casual. Victor stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, staring up at the man who had once taught him that silence was its own kind of war. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind pushed softly through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of dry leaves across the porch. Then, Darnell let out a breath that sounded like it carried years of knowing too much. "You look like you've been digging in places you shouldn't," Darnell said quietly, his voice rough but steady. Victor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every mile he'd driven settling on his back. "I found the pattern again," he replied, stepping up onto the porch, keeping his voice low like the shadows might be listening. "The silver vultures, they're here. They're running something bigger than just fear. They've built it on systems we helped design." Darnell flinched, just for a second, his jaw tightening the way a man tightens his grip on something sharp. He turned, pushing the door open with one shoulder, motioning for Victor to follow. Inside, the chapel smelled like old wood and dust, the air thick, with the kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. Darnell didn't sit in the pews. He walked straight to the back office, a small room cluttered with books, framed photographs, and papers stacked in uneven towers on a desk that looked like it hadn't been cleared in weeks. Victor followed, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Darnell sat slowly, leaning back with a heavy breath, rubbing his hands over his knees like the act of getting comfortable was its own kind of confession. "You already know what you found," Darnell said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement that carried the weight of resignation. Victor nodded, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket, the same printout Marcus had sent him, the same pattern they had once built under the name Operation Anchor. He laid it on the desk, his hand pressing the edges flat like it might keep the truth from curling up and slipping away. "Tell me what I missed," Victor whispered, staring at the man who had once promised they were building something that would help people, not trap them. Darnell leaned forward, his eyes falling on the paper like it was a grave marker. "You didn't miss anything," he murmured. "You just finally looked past the parts they let you see." Victor felt the floor shift under him, not in reality, but in the space between what he had believed and what he had refused to question. His voice came out rougher than he intended, tighter. "You knew, all this time?" Darnell didn't flinch this time. He just nodded, slow and heavy. Like every breath he took tasted like betrayal. "I knew when they rebranded it," he said softly. "I knew when they started shifting the funding off books, moving the contracts through back channels, pulling civilian oversight out of the loop. I knew when they started running it through private hands, and I knew when they used your name to sell it." Victor stepped back, pressing his hand against the wall like it might hold him upright. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the words coming out sharper than he wanted. Darnell looked up slowly, his eyes glassy but steady. "Because you believed in what you were building. And back then, I still wanted to believe it too." The words hit Victor harder than he expected, settling in his stomach like lead. He paced the small room, running his hands through his hair, feeling every step press heavier against the floor. "They're using it to target families, Darnell. To target us. They've got cops looking the other way, council members funding these cowards in the dark, and families like mine standing on burning porches wondering if anyone's ever gonna say it out loud. Darnell didn't move, didn't argue, didn't defend. He just sat there, shoulders sagging under the weight of something older than either of them were ready to name. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough to make Victor lean in just to hear it. "So say it out loud," Darnell whispered, the words almost shaking as they left his lips. "Say it, Vic. Say it in front of everyone." Victor stood there, frozen for a breath too long, the air thick between them, until finally something sharp clicked into place deep inside him. He gathered the paper, folded it slowly, and slipped it back into his pocket without another word. Then he turned toward the door, gripping the handle like it might burn his skin, and as he stepped back into the empty chapel, he knew exactly what he was going to do next. He was done asking permission. Victor didn't waste a second when he got back home. He didn't sit down. He didn't take his jacket off. He didn't even look at the clock. He went straight to the study, shutting the door behind him without turning on the lights, standing there for a moment in the quiet hum of the machines around him. His heart was pounding slower now, but heavier, as if every beat carried the weight of something he could no longer carry alone. He knew he couldn't afford to wait for someone else to fix this. He couldn't trust the sheriff's office, couldn't trust the local council, and sure as hell couldn't trust the so-called neighbors who had turned their faces away when the fire lit up the sky just 2 nights ago. He powered up his backup rig, the one that had never once touched the internet, the one Marcus had helped him build years ago for moments like this, when trust wasn't just thin, it was gone entirely. He started pulling files from every source he had, every photo, every timestamp, every plate number, every frame of video. He cross-referenced names with public records, overlaid timelines with traffic camera captures, pulled phone directories, property maps, anything that could build the case from top to bottom without leaving a single gap wide enough for someone to slip through. But it wasn't just about gathering the evidence anymore. It was about telling the whole story, the one nobody else dared to say out loud. He opened a blank document and began to write, not like an analyst logging data, but like a man tearing open a wound that had been stitched shut far too long. He wrote about Operation Anchor. He wrote about the silver vultures. He wrote about the technology he'd helped design and how it had been corrupted, repurposed to target families like his, under the lie of community protection. He wrote the names, the dates, the connections. He included the names of the sheriff, the councilwoman, the public works employees who had been caught on camera moving like ghosts in the night. He included the photographs from the Parker family's burned garage, the noose on his porch, the spray-painted threat on his wall. But most importantly, he included his own story, his own role, his own signature on the very blueprint they were using now. He didn't hide it. He didn't soften it. He ended the document with a single line, clear, simple, undeniable. "If it started with me, it ends with me." Victor encrypted the file and uploaded it to 3 different secure whistleblower platforms, the kind that didn't ask for names, didn't keep logs, didn't answer to anyone. He attached every piece of verifiable evidence he had, stripped of metadata that could be traced back to his family, but raw enough that no one could claim it was fabricated. He hovered his finger over the send button for just a moment longer than he expected, his breath catching somewhere between fear and something deeper relief, and then he pressed send. The uploads completed in seconds, faster than he thought possible. The file was gone, released, alive in places he would never be able to control again. For the first time in weeks, his hands trembled not with fear, but with finality. He sat back in the chair, staring at the empty screen, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle somewhere deep in his bones. When he stood up and walked out of the study, Charlene was waiting for him in the hallway, her arms folded tight across her chest, her eyes searching his face for something she hadn't yet found the courage to name. She didn't ask if he had done it. She already knew. Instead, she took a step closer, lowering her voice to something softer than he expected. "What now?" she asked, like she wasn't sure if she really wanted to hear the answer. Victor reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, squeezing just tight enough to let her know he was still standing. He pulled her gently toward the front door, stepping onto the porch where the wind had started to pick up, carrying the faintest hint of rain in the air. They stood there for a long while, side by side, staring out at the empty street, that had carried so much silence for far too long. Victor let out a slow breath, tilting his head just enough to glance at her without letting go. "Now," he whispered. "We wait." Charlene nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder, her body pressing closer like she needed to feel the ground beneath her feet again. They stayed like that until the porch light flickered once, then again, and the air grew still enough to feel like the world was holding its breath right along with them. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the night, Victor knew the truth had finally left his hands. And that, for the first time since all of this began, it belonged to everyone. Victor hadn't expected it to happen overnight, but part of him had hoped it might. He had hoped that once the truth was released, once the files were out in the open, someone would step in, someone bigger than this town, someone who could shut it all down. But days passed, and the quiet stretched longer than he could bear. The street outside stayed the same. The neighbors still moved like shadows, eyes down, mouths shut. The sheriff's cruiser still parked at the end of the block, like a silent threat that no one dared to question. Victor paced the living room late into the night, the weight of every second pressing heavier on his shoulders, wondering if any of it had even mattered. Charlene tried to pull him back, tried to hold him still, but he felt the distance growing between them like a widening crack in the foundation they had spent their entire lives building together. Maya stayed in her room more now, her sketchbooks stacked in uneven towers by the window, each page filled with darker lines, sharper edges, as if she was drawing the walls closing in around them before they could fully fall. Then, on the third morning, it happened. Not in the way Victor had imagined, not with breaking news headlines or federal agents storming the sheriff's office in front of live cameras. It started quieter, slower, like a ripple stretching across the surface of something deeper. The phone rang just after sunrise, a number Victor didn't recognize flashing across the screen. He answered on instinct, his voice low, guarded. "This is Caldwell." A breath on the other end, steady, measured. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Special Agent Renee Collins with the Department of Justice. I need you to listen very carefully." Victor's heart locked in his chest for half a second, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles turned white. "I'm listening," he managed to say. The agent didn't waste time. Her voice carried the kind of weight that didn't need convincing. "We've received multiple data packets over the past 48 hours. Your name is attached to every single one," she said calmly. "There's already an internal review underway, but we're advising you to stay put until we've secured local cooperation. Do not engage. Do not confront. Do not escalate." Victor felt something harden in his throat, something heavy enough to choke him if he let it. "And if they come to us first?" There was a pause on the other end, but the agent's voice didn't waver. "Document everything, we're coming." Victor hung up without another word, lowering the phone slowly, staring at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole. Charlene stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, searching his face for something that might tell her whether to hold her breath or let it go. "Who was it?" she asked quietly, stepping closer. Victor lifted his head, the corner of his mouth twitching like a man learning how to breathe again. "It's starting," he whispered. Charlene pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with something she hadn't let herself feel in dayshope. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, wrapping her arms around his chest, holding him tight, as if letting go might break whatever fragile thing had just begun to move in their favor. By noon, the first headlines started to break. Small-town surveillance network exposed in Colorado. Local officials linked to militia-style group under federal investigation. Anonymous whistleblower uncovers private use of government surveillance framework. The names weren't all there yet, the connections weren't fully mapped, but the ripple had become a wave. Victor watched from the porch, phone in hand, scrolling through the news feeds, as the story stretched farther than Clearwater Heights, reaching state outlets, national blogs, even independent watchdog groups who had been waiting for a crack in the dam. He could feel the shift, not just in the headlines, but in the way the neighborhood moved. The silence wasn't as thick anymore. Doors that had stayed shut for weeks now stood half open. Eyes that had turned away now flicked toward his house, with something closer to fear than contempt. By sundown, the sheriff's cruiser was gone. Just like that. No sirens, no warning, no announcement. The car that had marked its territory at the edge of the block disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind but empty street and questions hanging in the air. Victor sat on the porch long after the streetlights flickered on, the night stretching wide and quiet around him, Charlene brought him a blanket without saying a word, draping it over his shoulders before sitting beside him, leaning her head against his arm like she had done on the night they first moved in. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because in that moment, Victor knew the wall they had been pushing against wasn't as solid as it had seemed. It had started to crack, not because someone had given them permission, but because they had refused to be silent. And for the first time in weeks, the silence felt like it finally belonged to someone else. Victor wasn't sure how the idea first took root in his mind, but once it did, it refused to let go. Maybe it was the way the neighbors had started leaving their porch lights off, or the way the sheriff's car disappeared like it had never been there at all. Maybe it was the headlines slowly stacking up, each one pushing the story just a little farther into the light. Or maybe it was something simpler, something older, like the way Charlene had looked at him the night before, her hand resting on his chest, her voice barely a whisper when she'd said, "We're not the only ones." It had been years since Victor had spoken to more than a handful of people at once, and even longer since he'd stood in front of a crowd and let his own voice carry further than the walls of his own home. But this wasn't about speeches. This wasn't about leading some kind of movement. This was about forcing the town to look itself in the eye without turning away. So, he called a few neighbors, the ones who hadn't stopped waving, the ones who had watched the fire without crossing the street but hadn't pulled their blinds. He called the Parkers, who had every reason to leave but had stayed anyway. He called the woman who ran the local library and the older couple who always walked their dog just a little slower past his house after sundown. He didn't ask them to fight. He didn't ask them to pick sides. He just asked them to show up. And when Saturday evening rolled around, Victor stood on his front porch with his hands pressed flat against the railing, watching as one by one they came. It started small, just a few neighbors stepping onto their porches, hands tucked into coat pockets, eyes cautious but curious. Then more arrived, some with folding chairs, others with nothing but quiet footsteps and heavy glances. The Parkers stood at the edge of their yard, arms crossed but shoulders squared. The librarian brought a thermos of coffee, setting it on the table without saying a word. Even Reverend Price showed up, standing near the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low, his face unreadable but present all the same. Victor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their presence settle somewhere deeper than fear. He cleared his throat, not because he needed to speak yet, but because it felt like the only thing grounding him in that moment. Charlene stood behind him on the porch, Maya by her side, holding tightly to her mother's hand. Victor didn't start with a speech. He didn't start with the headlines or the files or the threats. He started with the truth. "I didn't bring you here tonight to tell you what you already know," he began, his voice steady but low, carrying just far enough to reach the edges of the crowd. "I brought you here because for weeks, all we've heard is silence, and I think it's time we stop pretending that silence is anything but a choice." A few heads nodded. A few more shifted their weight, folding their arms tighter across their chests. Victor took a breath, stepping down off the porch and onto the grass, closing the distance between himself and the people who had spent weeks pretending none of this belonged to them. He kept his hands at his sides, palms open, like he had nothing left to hide. "They told us to be quiet," he continued. "They told us to look the other way, to let this die behind closed doors. But it didn't die. It grew. It burned. It marked every one of us, whether we want to admit it or not." He paused, searching the faces in front of him, looking for something that felt like recognition. And when he found it, when he saw the slightest crack in the walls they had built around themselves, he pushed just a little further. "So tonight, I'm asking you to stop waiting for someone else to speak first. I'm asking you to take a stand, not because it's easy, but because it's the only thing left worth doing." The air felt heavier now, thicker, like every word was pulling them closer to something none of them had fully prepared for. Charlene stepped down beside him, her hand finding his, her voice quiet but steady. "We don't need speeches," she said softly, looking out at the small crowd. "We need to look each other in the eye and say, 'I see you. I hear you. I'm standing with you.'" For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then the Parkers took a step forward, closing the gap between their yard and the street. The librarian followed, setting down her thermos and crossing her arms like she'd been waiting for this longer than she cared to admit. One by one, the neighbors closed the distance, shrinking the space between silence and acknowledgement, until they stood together not as witnesses, but as a community finally ready to confront itself. Victor felt his throat tighten, his breath catching somewhere between relief and disbelief. He squeezed Charlene's hand, pulling Maya into the circle, feeling the warmth of something he hadn't dared to name until now. And as the sun sank low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground where they stood, Victor knew something had shifted, not in headlines, not in politics, but right here, in this moment, in the quiet defiance of people who had finally chosen to stop looking away. And for the first time in weeks, Victor Caldwell allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't standing alone anymore. Victor didn't sleep the night after the gathering. He sat on the porch long after the last neighbor had walked away, long after Charlene had gone inside and turned off the lights, long after Maya had fallen asleep on the couch with her sketchbook still clutched to her chest. He sat there in the dark with nothing but the sound of his own breath and the distant hum of the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't fear keeping him awake. It wasn't dread. It was something heavier, something sharper. It was the quiet hum of momentum, and it had taken root in his bones. The story had spread faster than he expected. Local news anchors who had once ignored him now stood outside council buildings with microphones in hand, their voices urgent, their eyes wide with something that looked a lot like guilt. National outlets had started picking it up too, running headlines that named names, pointing fingers at officials who had spent years hiding behind red tape and public statements. But the thing that struck Victor the most wasn't the news coverage, it was the people. People he'd never met. People from towns just like Clearwater Heights started sharing their own stories online. Posts flooded social media, stories about similar groups, similar threats, similar silences. It wasn't just his town anymore. It was bigger than that. And somehow, in all the noise, Victor felt smaller than ever. That morning, Charlene found him sitting at the kitchen table with his phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other. He was writing names, dates, locations, trying to make sense of the chaos as it unfolded faster than he could keep up. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching the way his jaw tensed every time the phone buzzed with a new update. Finally, she walked over, pulled out the chair beside him, and sat down slowly, her hand reaching for his without forcing him to stop what he was doing. "You can't carry all of this, Vic," she whispered, her voice low but steady. Victor didn't look up. He kept writing, the pen shaking slightly between his fingers. "If not me, then who?" he replied softly. Charlene squeezed his hand, holding on just long enough to make sure he felt it. "Not you alone," she whispered. Those 3 words hit him harder than anything the news had printed. He set the pen down slowly, leaned back in the chair, and let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for weeks. He knew she was right. He had known it for a long time. But hearing it spoken out loud forced him to face something he hadn't been ready to admit. He couldn't win this alone, so he stopped trying. Victor made phone calls that afternoon, not to reporters, not to agencies, but to people who had stood on his lawn, people who had shown up when they didn't have to. He called the Parkers first, inviting them back to the house for coffee. He called Mrs. Adler from the library, asking if she knew anyone who could help organize something bigger than one backyard meeting. And before the sun had fully set, his living room was filled with people who had once been strangers, sitting shoulder to shoulder, filling the space with quiet determination. They didn't have a name. They didn't have a leader. But they had a goal. It started small. A neighborhood watch that wasn't just for show. A phone tree to warn each other of suspicious activity. A printed list of every official on the town council, complete with contact information and public records. They started gathering stories, real stories, from real people documenting everything the local media had missed or refused to print. And when the national reporters started calling again, this time Victor didn't answer alone. He handed the phone to the Parkers. He handed it to Mrs. Adler. He handed it to the people who had lived in the shadows long before he ever arrived. And the movement grew. Within a week, they had filled the church basement twice. Within 2 weeks, people from neighboring towns started showing up, carrying their own stories, their own evidence, their own voices. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Victor realized something had shifted, not just in the town, but in him. He wasn't the voice anymore. He was part of the chorus. The real breakthrough came late one night when Charlene found a message slipped under their door. No name, no signature, just a simple note written in shaky handwriting. "We're tired of hiding. Tell us when to stand." Victor read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it on the kitchen table. He looked up at Charlene, his voice softer than it had been in days. "They're ready," he whispered. And just like that, they started planning something bigger. Not just a meeting, not just a gathering, but a public demonstration right in front of Town Hall. No permits, no permission, no more waiting for someone else to say it was time. The night before the demonstration, Victor stood in the backyard with Maya, watching her paint a handmade sign on a piece of old plywood they had found in the garage. The words she wrote were simple, but they carried more weight than any speech Victor could have written. "We deserve to live free." Maya looked up at him, her face calm but determined. "Do you think they'll listen this time?" she asked softly. Victor knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his voice steady. "I don't know," he whispered honestly, "but they'll have to hear us." The next morning, they marched. Not hundreds, not thousands, just dozens of neighbors, shoulder to shoulder, walking together down Main Street. No chants, no shouting, just presence, just people refusing to disappear. Victor held Maya's hand the whole way, Charlene on his other side, their feet moving in rhythm with the quiet power of a community that had finally decided to stop hiding. And when they reached the steps of Town Hall, they didn't wait for an invitation. They stood together, holding signs, holding each other, holding the space like it belonged to them all along. The mayor never came outside, the sheriff never showed his face, but the people did, more than Victor could count. They lined the sidewalks, they stood in doorways, they watched from windows, and for the first time, they didn't turn away. And when the sun dipped low behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the crowd, Victor knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed the march, something strange began to settle over Clearwater Heights. Not peace, exactly, not resolution, but something quieter and heavier than either of those things. It was the stillness that comes after a storm has passed through, the kind of hush that leaves people standing in the wreckage, not sure what to do with themselves now that the shouting has stopped. The sheriff resigned quietly 3 days later. No press conference, no apology, just an empty office and a notice taped to the glass door of the station. Councilwoman Kane disappeared next, slipping out of town in the middle of the night, her sprawling ranch left empty, the front gates chained shut like the land itself was trying to forget she ever walked there. The headlines kept coming, but they started to sound like echoes, each one a little more distant than the last. The Department of Justice announced a full investigation into the use of federal surveillance systems on civilians. National networks picked up the story again, this time pointing to other small towns with the same patterns, the same tactics, the same quiet abuses. But in Clearwater Heights, life didn't snap back into place the way Victor thought it might. The tension didn't dissolve. The wounds didn't close. People just kept moving. Victor spent more time on the porch those days, watching the street like it might give him permission to breathe again. Maya still carried her sketchbook everywhere she went, but her drawings had started to changeless shadows, more light. Charlene had begun planting again, her hands in the soil every morning, her quiet hum filling the air like a song only she could hear. And Victor, for the first time in weeks, found himself wondering if the fight had actually left him, or if it had simply moved into another form. Something slower, something quieter. One morning, long after the last reporter had packed up their camera gear and moved on to the next breaking story, Victor walked out to the edge of the yard with a shovel in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. Charlene stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her eyes following his every step. She didn't ask what he was doing. She already knew. Maya sat on the top step, knees pulled tight to her chest, watching with that same quiet focus she always carried when something important was about to happen. Victor stopped in the center of the yard, the place where the noose had once hung, the place where silence had once tried to swallow them whole. He set the box down gently on the ground, pressing his palm flat against the worn wood for just a moment longer than necessary. Then, without saying a word, he drove the shovel into the earth. The ground gave way easily, the soil soft from weeks of rain. He worked slow, steady, every movement measured, until the hole was wide enough, deep enough to swallow what had been left behind. He reached for the box, opening it carefully, revealing the twisted remains of the ropithi, one they had left on his porch, the one he had kept hidden in the back of the closet, waiting for the day he could put it somewhere it would never rise again. Charlene stepped down from the porch, her hand finding his shoulder, steadying him without forcing him to stop. Maya followed, standing beside them, her small hand slipping into his, grounding him in a way nothing else could. Victor let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, lowering the rope into the ground, watching as the memory of it disappeared beneath the earth. They stood together for a long while, saying nothing, letting the quiet fill the space between them like something sacred. And when Victor finally reached down to cover the hole, he didn't do it alone. Charlene knelt beside him, pressing her hands into the soil, her fingers brushing his as they worked. Maya leaned in too, her small palms packing the earth tight, sealing it shut like a promise. When they finished, Victor stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, looking down at the fresh mound of earth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bronze plaque he had ordered weeks ago, turning it over in his hands before pressing it into the ground above the grave they had made. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any monument ever could. "Let this be the last." Victor stepped back, slipping his arm around Charlene's waist, pulling Maya close to his side. They stood there in the morning light, the air cool and clean, the weight of the past pressing a little lighter on their shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Victor didn't feel like he was waiting for something to fall apart. He didn't feel like he was standing on the edge of another storm. He felt steady. Not finished. Not fixed, but steady. Charlene leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft but certain. "We did it," she whispered. Victor nodded slowly, his throat tight, his chest full in a way that felt almost too big to carry. "No," he replied quietly, pressing a kiss to her temple, holding her just a little tighter. "We started it." And as the sun rose higher, casting long, warm light across the yard, Victor Caldwell knew this was their ground, now not because they had claimed it through anger, but because they had stood when standing felt impossible, and they had done it together. Sometimes, life puts us in places where we have to choose between keeping our head down or standing up when it matters most. What happened to Victor Caldwell and his family is a reminder that silence doesn't protect it only gives wrongdoers more room to grow. You see, when good people stay quiet, when neighbors turn their backs, when communities ignore the signs, that's when fear takes over. But when even just one person says, "Enough is enough," when one family refuses to back down, it creates a ripple that reaches further than you can imagine. It's not about shouting the loudest, and it's not about fighting alone. It's about standing side by side, showing up for one another, and turning quiet courage into real change. So, if you're listening today, no matter your age, remember this: you are never too old to make a difference. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to walk away. Stand your ground, speak the truth, and help build the kind of community where every person feels seen, heard, and safe. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that matters. Thank you for watching.